What if one of the most feared warrior cultures in Eastern Europe was never what we were told it was? What if the Cossacks, icons of freedom, rebellion, and frontier warfare, were not a spontaneous brotherhood of runaway peasants, but the last visible remnant of an older empire that official history insists was erased centuries earlier? This investigation begins in the wide, unforgiving belt of land stretching from the Black Sea to the Caspian, a region historians politely call the Eurasian steppe. To ancient empires, it was a corridor of invasion. To medieval kingdoms, a buffer zone of chaos. And to modern historians, it is a place where records thin out, stories contradict themselves, and uncomfortable questions begin to surface. Here, in this borderland between Europe and Asia, two names appear in history books, but never together: Khazaria and the Cossacks. According to the official narrative, Khazaria was a powerful medieval polity that flourished between the 7th and 10th centuries. A steppe empire that controlled trade routes, imposed tribute on Slavic tribes, and, most unusually, adopted Judaism as its ruling religion. Then, almost as abruptly as it rose, Khazaria vanished, defeated, fragmented, absorbed into history's margins. The Cossacks, on the other hand, are presented as something entirely different. They supposedly emerged much later, rough bands of free warriors appearing along the southern frontiers of Muscovy and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, stateless, unruly, fiercely independent. Men who rejected feudal control and lived by the sword and the saddle. Two peoples, two eras, no connection. At least, that is how the story is usually told. But history is rarely shaped only by what is preserved. It is shaped just as much by what is removed. In the late 17th century, as the Romanov dynasty consolidated power over a rapidly expanding Russian state, something unusual happened. The chaotic frontier was reorganized. Local identities were standardized. Oral traditions were discouraged. Archives were centralized. And the past, especially the past of rebellious military communities, was rewritten into something safer. This is where our mystery begins. Because when we look closely at early descriptions of Cossack society, their laws, symbols, military organization, even the geography they occupied, strange echoes begin to appear. Echoes of a structure that looks less like a spontaneous peasant uprising, and more like the residue of an older, disciplined system of rule. Why do early Cossack hosts appear suddenly, already fully formed, with complex codes of conduct and command hierarchies? Why do their territories align almost perfectly with former Khazar strongholds described in Arabic and Byzantine sources? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why does the Romanov-era historical narrative insist so forcefully that no connection ever existed? These are not idle questions. They strike at the heart of how power legitimizes itself. Empires do not merely conquer land, they conquer memory. Throughout history, ruling dynasties have understood one basic truth: whoever controls the past controls the moral right to rule the present. Competing legacies are dangerous. Alternative origins undermine authority. And rival claims to antiquity are intolerable. If the Cossacks were merely runaway serfs, then they could be disciplined, absorbed, or crushed. But if they were heirs to a defeated state, a successor culture carrying fragments of Khazaria forward in law, warfare, and identity, then the Romanov claim to absolute sovereignty becomes far less secure. This documentary is not about proving a single dramatic conspiracy. It is about following evidence where it leads, even when it leads away from the version of history we are most comfortable with. We will examine the official record, And then we will examine what does not quite fit inside it. We will look at the collapse of Khazaria and ask what really happens when empires disappear. We will trace the emergence of the Cossacks and ask how fully developed societies can materialize out of historical silence. And we will confront an uncomfortable possibility that the Romanov dynasty did not merely inherit Russia, it curated it. Because sometimes the most important links in history are not broken, they are hidden. And the deeper we dig into the Cossack-Khazaria question, the clearer it becomes that this is not just a story about medieval nomads or frontier warriors. It is a story about how history itself is shaped, trimmed, and presented, and how entire identities can be buried beneath the weight of an official narrative. This investigation begins with what we have been told, but it will not end there, because the strangest details have not yet been brought to light. Before we can understand what might have been hidden, we first have to understand what was officially preserved. According to conventional history, Khazaria was a steppe empire that emerged sometime in the 7th century, rising quietly along the northern shores of the Black and Caspian Seas. Its power rested not on monumental cities or imperial pageantry, but on control of rivers, of trade routes, of movement itself. The Volga, the Don, and the Dnieper became arteries through which silver, slaves, furs, and grain flowed between the Islamic world, Byzantium, and northern Europe. By the 9th century, Arab geographers described Khazaria as wealthy, organized, and unusually stable for a nomadic polity. It collected tribute rather than territory. It ruled indirectly rather than through mass settlement. And most strikingly, its ruling elite adopted Judaism, creating a political anomaly that still unsettles historians today. Then, according to the timeline, Khazaria fell. The standard date given is the mid-10th century, when a Russ's prince, Sviatoslav of Kiev, launched a series of devastating campaigns against Khazar strongholds. Fortresses were destroyed, trade networks collapsed, the Khaganate fragmented. And within a few generations, Khazaria allegedly vanished from the historical stage, leaving behind little more than scattered references and unresolved debates. This disappearance is presented as final. After that point, history books pivot elsewhere. They move toward the rise of Kievan Rus', the Mongol invasions, the formation of Muscovy, and eventually the emergence of the Russian state. Khazaria becomes a footnote, an interesting curiosity, but a dead end. The Cossacks, meanwhile, appear much later. Most official accounts place their emergence between the 15th and 16th centuries. They are described as loose confederations of runaway peasants, criminals, and adventurers who fled feudal control and settled in the lawless borderlands along the Don, Dnieper, and Ural rivers. These men, we are told, forged a rough, egalitarian culture defined by military skill, horsemanship, and an intense love of autonomy. They elected leaders, they lived communally, they raided, defended borders, and sold their services as mercenaries. Over time, they were gradually absorbed into the expanding Russian state, serving as frontier troops in exchange for privileges. This narrative is neat, linear, comfortable. Khazaria rises and falls, centuries pass. Then, in an entirely different context, the Cossacks appear. And yet, even at first glance, something about this sequence feels strained. History rarely leaves voids so clean. Empires do not evaporate. Cultures do not simply dissolve without residue. Administrative knowledge, legal customs, military traditions, and population groups tend to persist, especially in regions where central authority is weak. and the Eurasian steppe was nothing if not resistant to total erasure. If Khazaria truly disappeared in the 10th century, what happened to its administrators, its warriors, its tribute collectors, its border guards? What became of the people whose entire social order was built around steppe governance and military mobility? Official history offers vague answers: assimilation, migration, absorption into neighboring populations. But rarely does it specify where, how, or under whose authority. At the same time, when early Cossack communities first appear in written sources, they do not look like social experiments in progress. They appear already structured, already disciplined, already operating under recognizable systems of law and command. This is not what spontaneous peasant movements usually look like. The earliest descriptions of Cossack hosts speak of councils, oaths, codified punishments, territorial jurisdictions, and established military ranks. These are not improvised arrangements, they are inherited ones. Even their geography raises questions. The Don Cossacks emerge along the Don River. The Zaporozhian Cossacks settle along the lower Dnieper. These regions overlap almost perfectly with areas once described by Byzantine and Arab writers as Khazar-controlled zones. Coincidence is the word most often used, but coincidence begins to strain when patterns repeat. Now we move forward in time. By the 17th century, a new force dominates Eastern Europe, the Romanov dynasty. Following the chaos of the time of troubles, the Romanovs present themselves as restorers of order, continuity, and legitimacy. They centralize power, they expand territory, and crucially, they begin to standardize history. This is not unusual. Every empire does it. Chronicles are edited. Regional accounts are harmonized. Conflicting narratives are suppressed in favor of a single, state-approved version of the past. The goal is not simply accuracy, it is cohesion, and cohesion requires clean origins. The Romanovs inherited a vast and unstable realm, filled with semi-autonomous military communities, many of which had traditions that did not align neatly with Moscow's authority. The Cossacks were among the most powerful and dangerous of these groups. They were skilled fighters. They were culturally distinct, and they had a long memory. In Romanov historiography, the Cossacks are gradually reframed. Their origins are simplified. Their past is shortened. Their identity is detached from any deeper historical lineage and repositioned as a product of Russian expansion rather than a predecessor to it. At the same time, Khazaria fades further into obscurity. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Khazaria is no longer treated as a formative power in Eastern Europe, but as an oddity, a failed state with no meaningful descendants. Academic interest persists, but politically the story is closed, or so it appears. But history is not only written in chronicles, it is written in customs, in laws, in patterns of settlement and conflict. And when we compare what we know of Khazaria's structure with what we observe in early Cossack society, the official separation begins to feel artificial. This is where the ground starts to shift, because if the accepted timeline is correct, then we are asked to believe that a sophisticated steppe empire collapsed completely, leaving no institutional descendants, only for a remarkably similar warrior society to emerge centuries later in the same regions, operating under eerily familiar principles. And we are asked not to notice. The Romanov narrative asks us to see these events as unrelated, to accept historical silence as evidence of absence, to trust that what was not preserved was not important. But historians know better. Silence is rarely neutral. As we prepare to examine the anomalies, those details that refuse to sit quietly inside the official story, we must keep one thing in mind. History does not only lie in what survives, it lies in what was never meant to. Because once we begin looking closely at the gaps, the contradictions, and the oddly convenient discontinuities, the neat separation between Khazaria and the Cossacks begins to dissolve, and what emerges in its place is far more unsettling than coincidence. The first cracks are already visible, and the next piece of evidence will make them impossible to ignore. When a historical narrative begins to fracture, it rarely does so all at once. It starts with small inconsistencies, minor details that seem harmless in isolation, a phrase in an old chronicle, a symbol that appears where it should not, a custom that predates the people said to practice it. Individually, these details are easy to dismiss. Collectively, they begin to behave like loose threads that, when pulled, threaten to unravel the entire tapestry. This is where the official story of Khazaria and the Cossacks begins to strain. The first anomaly appears in law. Early Cossack communities were governed not by feudal codes imposed from above, but by internally enforced legal systems. Punishments were standardized. Authority was conditional. Leaders could be elected and removed. These laws were not written hastily in response to frontier chaos. They were consistent across regions and remarkably stable over time. This is unusual. Peasant uprisings do not produce legal continuity. Refugee communities do not generate codified systems of governance that persist for generations. Yet Cossack law appears fully formed in the earliest records, as if inherited rather than invented. Where did this legal culture come from? Now consider the second anomaly, military organization. Cossack hosts were divided into units with fixed ranks, command hierarchies, and standardized tactics. Their cavalry doctrine emphasized mobility, feigned retreats, and decentralized command, techniques identical to those described in Arabic and Byzantine accounts of Khazar warfare. This is not a coincidence of style. Military systems are among the hardest cultural traits to transmit without direct lineage. They require training traditions, shared doctrine, and institutional memory. And yet, official history asks us to believe that these methods emerged spontaneously among escaped serfs. How could men with no prior access to elite military training replicate the strategic culture of a steppe empire that supposedly vanished centuries earlier? The third anomaly lies in symbols. Early Cossack seals, banners, and insignia display motifs that do not originate in Orthodox Christian tradition. Solar symbols, steppe animal imagery, and abstract geometric marks appear repeatedly. Symbols that closely resemble those found on Khazar artifacts recovered from burial sites along the Volga and Don. These symbols persist even after the Cossacks are formally Christianized and integrated into Russian state structures. They are tolerated, not explained. Why would an Orthodox empire allow heterodox symbols to survive within one of its most militarized populations, unless those symbols carried an identity too deeply rooted to erase outright? The fourth anomaly emerges in language. The word Cossack itself does not originate in Slavic tradition. Linguists trace it to Turkic roots, meaning free man, wanderer, or one who stands apart. This alone is not controversial. What is controversial is how consistently Turkic administrative and military terms appear in early Cossack vocabulary, titles, ranks, and procedural language that mirror those used in Khazar governance. If the Cossacks were simply Slavic peasants fleeing oppression, why would their institutional language be Turkic rather than Slavic? The fifth anomaly is geographic. Cossack settlements align with precision along former Khazar corridors. not merely in the same general region, but in the same strategic nodes, river junctions, portage routes, and defensive choke points described in medieval trade accounts. These are not locations one stumbles upon by accident. They are places chosen by planners who understand logistics, taxation, and military defense. This raises an uncomfortable question. Who was doing the planning? The sixth anomaly appears in external perception. Early Ottoman, Polish, and Persian sources do not describe the Cossacks as peasants or bandits. They describe them as a distinct people, dangerous, organized, and politically aware. They are treated as an autonomous force, not as social debris. Foreign observers often recognize realities that domestic narratives try to suppress. The seventh anomaly lies in the Romanov response itself. From the 17th century onward, repeated efforts are made to redefine Cossack identity. Their autonomy is curtailed. Their histories are rewritten. Their rebellions are framed as criminal rather than political. And crucially, their origins are simplified in official chronicles. This is not how empires treat rootless communities. It is how they treat rival legacies. Each of these anomalies could be explained away individually: legal coincidence, military borrowing, cultural blending, geographic inevitability. But taken together, they begin to form a pattern that suggests continuity rather than rupture. At this stage, we are not yet proposing a theory. We are only collecting evidence, laying fragments side by side, observing how they align when no one is trying to force them into a predetermined frame. And the alignment is troubling, because the more closely we examine the Cossacks, the less they resemble an accidental society, and the more they resemble a successor structure. A structure that retained enough of an older system to function independently, but not enough to openly challenge the rising empires around it. This is the point at which historians often grow uncomfortable, not because the evidence is weak, but because it points in a direction that destabilizes accepted timelines. If Khazaria truly vanished in the 10th century, then why do its institutional fingerprints appear so vividly in communities that emerge centuries later? If the Romanov narrative is correct, then why does it require so much simplification, so much silence, so much historical compression to maintain? Loose threads, when ignored, remain harmless, but once pulled, they demand attention. And the threads we have uncovered do not lead to random chaos. They lead somewhere specific. They lead toward an explanation that has long been dismissed, not because it lacks evidence, but because of what it implies. Because if these anomalies are not accidental, then the separation between Khazaria and the Cossacks is not historical. It is artificial. And the next step in this investigation is to ask why such an artificial boundary would need to exist in the first place. To do that, we must begin connecting the dots. And once we do, the pattern becomes impossible to unsee. The deeper we dig, the less stable the official story becomes. And the real structure, hidden beneath centuries of narrative control, starts to come into focus. When individual anomalies begin to align, history stops behaving like a collection of isolated facts and starts behaving like a system. This is the moment where coincidence gives way to structure. Up to this point, we have resisted drawing conclusions. We have examined laws, symbols, language, military doctrine, and geography as separate fragments. But fragments are only misleading when viewed alone. Once assembled, they reveal intention, and intention leaves patterns. Let us begin with time. The accepted narrative insists on a hard break in the 10th century, the fall of Khazaria, followed by a long historical silence. Then, centuries later, the Cossacks appear. But this silence is not empty. It is simply undocumented in state-approved chronicles. Archaeologically, the steppe does not go quiet. Settlement layers do not vanish. Burial practices continue. Trade routes remain active. Fortified nodes along the Don and Volga show continuity of use rather than abandonment. What changes is not the population, but the label. When empires collapse, their names disappear faster than their people. Now consider governance. Khazaria was not a centralized empire in the Roman sense. It ruled through layered authority, tribute networks, military oversight, semi-autonomous local leaders, and a professional warrior class tasked with enforcement rather than administration. This is crucial, because early Cossack organization mirrors this structure almost exactly. Cossack hosts operated as autonomous military administrative units. They controlled territory, enforced internal law, collected resources, and negotiated with external powers, all without full integration into any state. This is not the behavior of fugitives. It is the behavior of a surviving system operating below imperial visibility. Next, consider legitimacy. Khazaria's power rested not on ethnic purity or territorial claims, but on control of movement and trade. It did not need monuments to legitimize itself. It needed corridors, rivers, passages. The Cossacks inherited the same logic. They did not build capitals. They occupied junctions. They controlled access. They dominated waterways. Their strategic value to Muscovy was not cultural. It was logistical. This explains something official history struggles to answer. Why did the Russian state tolerate Cossack autonomy for so long? Empires do not share sovereignty out of kindness. They do so out of necessity. The Romanovs needed the Cossacks because the Cossacks already controlled the arteries of expansion. Attempting to dismantle them outright would have destabilized the frontier beyond control. So instead, the state absorbed them gradually while stripping away their past. This brings us to narrative engineering. When the Romanov dynasty standardized Russian history in the 18th century, it faced a dilemma. It could not deny the existence of the Cossacks. They were too visible, too powerful, too embedded in military reality. But it could redefine them. By presenting the Cossacks as marginal people who emerged accidentally, the state neutralized their historical claim to legitimacy. A people with no deep past has no competing right to rule, and by isolating Khazaria as a dead civilization with no heirs, the Romanovs severed a dangerous continuity. The connection was not disproven. It was made unthinkable. Now consider probability. What are the odds that a complex legal military culture would independently reemerge in precisely the same geography, using similar organizational logic, linguistic remnants, and strategic behavior, centuries after its alleged disappearance? Low. Extraordinarily low. History does not replicate itself so precisely without inheritance. An inheritance does not require bloodlines alone. It requires institutional memory. The steppe is uniquely suited to preserving such memory. Unlike sedentary civilizations that collapse with their cities, steppe systems survive through mobility. They move, they adapt, they fragment and recombine. Khazaria did not need to survive as a state to survive as a structure. It only needed to outlive the chroniclers. At this point, the metaphor becomes unavoidable. What we are looking at is not a vanished empire, but a submerged one. Like an ancient city beneath a modern capital, its foundations still dictate the shape of what stands above it. Streets curve where old walls once stood. Power flows where older conduits remain. The Cossacks were not an invention. They were a resurfacing. This also explains the intensity with which their independence was eventually crushed. Rebellions led by figures like Stenka Razin and Yemelyan Pugachev were not merely social uprisings. They were treated as existential threats, and empires reserve existential responses for rival systems, not for bandits. By the 19th century, the process was complete. The Cossacks had been fully integrated, their histories rewritten, their autonomy curtailed, their identity folded into imperial mythology. Khazaria, meanwhile, remained safely confined to academic debate, abstracted, depoliticized, and disconnected from the present. But the structure had already done its work. The Romanov state expanded along corridors first mastered by Khazar administrators. It relied on frontier militaries shaped by steppe logic. It governed a space whose invisible architecture had been laid centuries earlier. The deeper we dig, the clearer the pattern becomes. This is not a story of disappearance followed by coincidence. It is a story of transformation followed by suppression. And once this pattern is recognized, it becomes impossible to maintain the official separation between Khazaria and the Cossacks without ignoring overwhelming structural evidence. We are no longer dealing with anomalies. We are dealing with continuity, which brings us to the moment historians are trained to avoid. The moment when analysis forces a conclusion. Because if Khazaria did not truly disappear, and if the Cossacks were not a historical accident, then the question is no longer whether there was a link between them. The question becomes far more dangerous. Why did the Romanov dynasty need that link to be forgotten? And what truth emerges when the final piece of the puzzle is placed where it belongs? That answer lies just ahead, and it changes everything. All the fragments we have examined, the laws, the symbols, the language, the geography, the military logic, have been circling the same conclusion without naming it. Now the name can no longer be avoided. All these clues point to one almost unbelievable conclusion. The Cossacks were not a new people at all. They were the surviving structure of Khazaria, transformed, decentralized, and deliberately stripped of its imperial name, yet carrying its functional DNA forward into a new age. This is the hypothesis that history has quietly stepped around for centuries, not because it lacks coherence, but because of what it implies. If Khazaria did not vanish, but instead dissolved into successor formations that later reemerged as the Cossacks, then the medieval and early modern history of Eastern Europe must be reread entirely. The timeline does not break, it bends. Under this interpretation, the fall of Khazaria in the 10th century was not an extinction event. It was a political collapse, followed by strategic adaptation. The centralized Khaganate fell under military pressure, but its administrative class, military professionals, and steppe governance systems did what steppe systems have always done. They dispersed. They embedded themselves into the frontier. They abandoned monuments and crowns, but preserved function. This immediately resolves several anomalies. The sudden appearance of fully formed Cossack law ceases to be mysterious. It was inherited, passed down through generations not as written codes preserved in archives, but as lived systems enforced through custom and oath. Steppe law survives best when memorized, practiced, and ritualized. The military continuity also makes sense. Cavalry doctrine, decentralized command, mobility-based warfare. These are not techniques one invents in isolation. They are transmitted, trained, rehearsed across generations. The Cossacks did not rediscover steppe warfare. They never lost it. The linguistic evidence aligns perfectly under this model. Turkic administrative language persists not because peasants borrowed words at random, but because institutions retain terminology long after ethnic identities blur. Titles outlive bloodlines, functions outlive names. Even the symbolic persistence becomes logical. Symbols are among the hardest cultural elements to erase, because they operate below conscious ideology. A banner can survive conversion. A sign can outlast a creed. The abstract motifs found among early Cossacks are not decorative accidents. They are residues of an older identity carried forward quietly, cautiously. Under this hypothesis, the Cossacks are not rebels at the margins of history. They are custodians of a defeated order. This also reframes the Romanov reaction. If the Cossacks represented not merely unruly frontier troops, but the last living embodiment of a pre-Romanov system of steppe governance, then their autonomy was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Empires fear alternatives more than enemies. An enemy can be defeated. An alternative proves that another way of organizing power once existed, and might exist again. By detaching the Cossacks from Khazaria, Romanov historiography achieved something essential. It collapsed historical depth. It shortened memory. It turned a successor culture into a social anomaly rather than a political lineage. And once that lineage was broken on paper, it could be broken in practice. The rebellions now read differently. Stenka Razan's uprising ceases to look like a peasant revolt, and begins to resemble a resistance movement defending an older autonomy. Pugachev's challenge to imperial authority reads less like madness and more like a claim, however distorted, to an alternative legitimacy rooted in frontier tradition. Even the ferocity of the state response becomes understandable. These were not bandits. They were reminders. There is an old principle in historiography. Myths persist where documents vanish. And in the steppe, myths are not fairy tales. They are memory encoded in story. Legends of lost steppe kings, vanished orders, and ancient freedoms echo throughout Cossack folklore. These stories have long been dismissed as romantic exaggerations. But folklore does not invent structures. It preserves them in symbolic form when open transmission becomes dangerous. Under pressure, memory changes its clothing. It hides inside song. It survives inside ritual. It waits. What makes this hypothesis so unsettling is not its complexity, but its simplicity. We do not need to imagine secret cabals or forbidden archives. We only need to accept that empires collapse unevenly, and that survival does not always announce itself. Khazaria did not need to survive as Khazaria. It only needed to survive as a way of organizing space, power, and violence on the steppe. And that is exactly what the Cossacks were. By the time the Romanov dynasty emerged, this structure had already adapted to centuries of pressure. It had shed overt imperial identity. It had learned to exist as a military culture without a crown, but it had not forgotten itself, which explains the final, lingering discomfort in official history. Why was it necessary to insist so strongly that Khazaria had no heirs? Why was the possibility of continuity treated not merely as unlikely, but as irrelevant? Because acknowledging continuity would mean acknowledging that the Romanov state was not the first to master the steppe. It was the last to overwrite it. In this light, history does not appear as a straight line of progress, but as a palimpsest, new text written over old, yet never fully erasing what lies beneath. The final piece of the puzzle does not reveal a hidden empire rising again in triumph. It reveals something quieter, a defeated system that refused to die, a structure that learned to survive invisibly, and a history that was not lost, but deliberately left unnamed. Now the question is no longer whether this hypothesis fits the evidence. The question is why it fits so well, and whether the remaining evidence, long ignored or misinterpreted, confirms what we have begun to see. Because if this theory is correct, then the Cossacks were never merely servants of empire. They were its shadow, and shadows exist only where something solid once stood. At this point, a careful listener might ask the most reasonable question of all. If this theory is true, if the Cossacks were a surviving structure of Khazaria, then where is the proof? History, after all, is not built on intuition alone. It demands evidence, corroboration, patterns that persist even when viewed from different angles. So now we do what any serious investigation must do at this stage. We test the hypothesis against what remains. The first layer of reinforcement comes not from Russian sources but from outside them. Arabic and Persian geographers writing between the 9th and 12th centuries do not describe Khazaria as a fragile state on the brink of collapse. They describe it as administratively resilient, capable of adapting to pressure through decentralization. Several accounts note that Khazar authority functioned through regional elites and military colonies rather than a single rigid capital. This matters, because systems designed this way do not disappear cleanly. When attacked, they fragment, yet continue operating in pieces. Now compare this with what early modern European observers encountered when they first met the Cossacks. They did not encounter chaos. They encountered order without a crown, authority without a throne, military power without a capital. That is not absence. That is residue. The second reinforcement comes from continuity of population. Genetic studies of steppe populations show long-term regional persistence rather than replacement. Waves of conquest altered political control, but did not erase local elites or warrior classes. The idea that Khazaria's administrative and military population simply vanished has no demographic support. People do not disappear. They adapt. They intermarry. They rename themselves. Which brings us to the third reinforcement, administrative behavior. Early treaties between the Cossacks and neighboring states read less like agreements with rebels and more like negotiations between sovereign entities. Cossack leaders insisted on recognition of territory, internal law, and diplomatic autonomy. These demands were not improvised. They reflect a deep understanding of political leverage. Peasant movements do not negotiate like states. Former states do. The fourth reinforcement comes from what was destroyed, or quietly ignored. Khazar archaeological sites suffered systematic neglect during periods of intense Russian historical consolidation. Excavations were delayed. Interpretations were narrowed. Findings that suggested continuity were reframed as anomalies rather than signals. At the same time, Cossack material culture was aggressively reclassified as early Russian, stripping it of its steppe context. This is a familiar tactic in imperial historiography. When continuity is inconvenient, redefine it. Now let us address the counterarguments. The most common objection is chronological. Critics argue that the gap between Khazaria's fall and the rise of the Cossacks is too large to support continuity. But this objection assumes that continuity must be visible to be real. History offers countless examples where traditions survive for centuries in liminal spaces, frontiers, mountains, deserts, precisely because they escape centralized documentation. The steppe is one of those spaces. Silence in archives does not equal silence on the ground. Another objection points to religious difference. Khazaria's elite adopted Judaism, while the Cossacks were overwhelmingly Orthodox Christian. But this objection misunderstands how steppe systems function. Religion in steppe polities was often instrumental rather than absolute. Conversion did not erase administrative logic. Moreover, conversion is one of the most common survival strategies for subordinated elites. Faith changes faster than structure. A third objection claims that similarities in warfare and governance are simply the result of shared environment. This argument fails under scrutiny. Environment shapes tactics, but not legal codes. Geography influences mobility, but not symbolic continuity. Ecology alone does not explain inherited administrative language or negotiated autonomy across centuries. At some point, similarity exceeds coincidence, and that point has already been passed. There is also a psychological counterargument, less often spoken aloud, but deeply influential. Accepting this theory requires abandoning the comfort of linear history. It forces us to accept that states do not rise neatly from the ashes of others. That power does not reset cleanly. That suppressed systems can persist beneath official narratives, shaping outcomes long after their names are erased. This discomfort is not academic. It is political. Because once we accept that the Cossacks may represent a submerged Khazar continuity, we must also accept that the Romanov state did not emerge into a vacuum. It emerged into a contested landscape of memory, and it won. Not only with armies, but with chronicles. This is why alternative explanations struggle to account for the full picture. They explain pieces, but not the whole. They treat symptoms as causes. They mistake surface identity for structural origin. The continuity model does not require speculative leaps. It requires only that we take steppe history seriously on its own terms. Fluid, adaptive, and resistant to archival containment. When we do, the evidence aligns. Legal systems no longer appear out of nowhere. Military traditions no longer appear miraculous. Geographic precision no longer appears accidental. And the Romanov insistence on narrative separation no longer appears neutral. It appears strategic. By now, the question, "Is there proof?" has transformed into a more unsettling one. How much proof was never allowed to survive? History is not only written by the victors, it is curated by them. And what remains after curation is rarely the full story. At this stage of the investigation, disbelief becomes harder to sustain than acceptance, because the hypothesis does not stretch the evidence. It organizes it. And the more angles from which we approach the past, the more consistently the same shape emerges beneath the surface. A shape that looks less like coincidence and more like inheritance. Which brings us to the final question, perhaps the most important of all. If this continuity is real, what does it mean? Not just for the Cossacks, but for how we understand history itself. That reflection awaits us next. Once the evidence settles into place, the investigation can no longer remain purely technical. At this stage, facts give way to meaning. If the continuity between Khazaria and the Cossacks is real, if what we have traced is not coincidence, but inheritance, then the implications reach far beyond a single people or a disputed timeline. They force us to confront how history itself is constructed, controlled, and weaponized. Because this is no longer a question of what happened. It is a question of what was allowed to be remembered. History, as it is commonly taught, moves in clean arcs. Empires rise, empires fall, and new orders emerge from the ruins. But this model assumes something that reality rarely provides: closure. In truth, power systems rarely end. They fragment, disguise themselves, and resurface under new names. What we have uncovered suggests that Khazaria did not die. It dissolved into the frontier. And that the Cossacks were not rebels living outside history, but carriers of a suppressed political memory, moving silently through it. If that is true, then the Romanov Empire was not simply a successor state. It was a replacement regime. And replacement regimes do not merely conquer land, they must neutralize rival narratives. This reframes the long struggle between the Russian state and the Cossacks in an entirely different light. What appears in official history as a series of unruly uprisings begins to resemble a prolonged process of erasure. Autonomy was not crushed because it was chaotic, but because it represented an alternative model of authority, one rooted in steppe logic rather than centralized monarchy. A model that had worked before and could work again. This helps explain the psychological intensity with which the Romanov state pursued standardization. Education, law, military hierarchy, even folklore were gradually reshaped to align with imperial identity. Anything that suggested pre-imperial continuity was either romanticized into harmless legend or dismissed as primitive disorder. Memory was not destroyed, it was defanged. And the Cossacks, once the inheritors of a mobile, decentralized, trade-controlling system, were slowly transformed into ceremonial guardians of empire, symbols of loyalty rather than agents of autonomy. What was lost in this process was not merely political independence, it was historical depth. When a people are cut off from their origins, they become easier to manage. Without a remembered past, resistance loses coherence. Identity collapses into costume. This is why the question of Khazaria's legacy matters, not because it restores a forgotten empire to glory, but because it exposes how history is flattened to serve power. The steppe has always been hostile to centralized narratives. Its societies evolved to survive collapse, not to commemorate it. They carried memory and practice rather than parchment, and that made them dangerous to states that relied on written legitimacy. Khazaria mastered this environment. The Cossacks inherited it. The Romanovs feared it, and fear leaves fingerprints. What we are seeing, then, is not a hidden conspiracy, but a familiar pattern repeated throughout history. Dominant powers simplifying the past to stabilize the present. Complex lineages are broken. Continuities are denied. Rivals are reframed as accidents. The result is a version of history that feels orderly, but lacks depth. There is also a quieter implication, one that reaches beyond Eastern Europe. If Khazaria survived as structure rather than state, then how many other vanished civilizations may have done the same? How many frontier societies around the world are not primitive offshoots, but residual systems, older than the empires that eventually absorbed them? History may not be a sequence of beginnings. It may be a series of suppressions. Seen this way, the past becomes less like a timeline and more like a landscape layered with ruins, some visible, some buried, all influencing what stands above them. And once you recognize this pattern, it becomes difficult to stop seeing it, because the truth was never erased completely. It was distributed, hidden across customs, geographies, habits, and contradictions that only align when someone is willing to look past official explanations. This is why such inquiries are unsettling. They do not replace one myth with another. They remove the comfort of myth altogether, and they leave us with a responsibility to question neat endings, to distrust historical silence, and to recognize that what survives longest is not always what is written, but what continues to function. The Cossacks were not anomalies on the edge of empire. They were living fossils of a defeated order. And Khazaria was not a dead civilization. It was a buried one. History did not forget it by accident. It moved on deliberately. The question now is not whether this continuity existed. The question is whether we are prepared to acknowledge what it reveals about the way history is shaped, and about how much of it still lies just beneath the surface, waiting to be recognized. Because once you accept that power can erase memory without erasing structure, the past stops being settled, and the present stops being innocent. That realization carries weight, and it leads us inevitably to the final reckoning, to the end of this investigation, and to the question of what we do with the truth once we see it. We began this investigation with a simple question. What if the Cossacks were never what history told us they were? Along the way, that question expanded, deepened, and became something far more unsettling. We traced the official narrative of Khazaria's disappearance. We examined the sudden emergence of the Cossacks. We followed the anomalies, legal, military, linguistic, geographic, and watched as they aligned into a structure too coherent to ignore. What we found was not a forgotten footnote. We found continuity. The Khazar state, as a named empire, fell. Its capitals were destroyed, its chronicles fragmented. But its way of organizing power did not vanish. It adapted, it decentralized, it submerged itself into the frontier, where empires are weakest and memory is hardest to police. There it survived. The Cossacks were not an accident of history, they were its afterimage, a successor structure that carried forward the logic of steppe governance without the burden of imperial titles, a system that controlled corridors instead of capitals, that enforced law without crowns, that remembered power not through monuments, but through practice. And when the Romanov dynasty rose, it encountered not empty land, but an inherited architecture of authority. The solution was not total destruction. It was redefinition. By severing the Cossacks from any deeper historical lineage, the Romanov state neutralized a rival past. By isolating Khazaria as a dead civilization with no heirs, it closed a dangerous loop of legitimacy. And by compressing centuries of continuity into a narrative of coincidence, it ensured that the question would never be asked. Until now, this is not a story about villains and heroes. It is a story about systems, about how power persists beyond names, about how history is shaped not only by what is written, but by what is made unthinkable, about how entire ways of organizing society can be erased from memory while continuing to function beneath the surface. The Cossacks were absorbed, disciplined, and transformed into symbols of imperial loyalty. Their autonomy faded. Their rebellions were reframed. Their past was shortened. Khazaria, meanwhile, became a curiosity, discussed, debated, but safely disconnected from the present. But the steppe never forgets completely. Its memory is written in roots, in customs, in patterns of control that outlast dynasties. And once you learn to read those patterns, history stops appearing as a clean sequence of rise and fall. It begins to look layered, unfinished. This investigation does not claim to close the case. History rarely offers closure. What it offers instead is responsibility. The responsibility to question inherited narratives, to examine silences as carefully as statements, and to recognize that official history is often a negotiation between truth and power. If the link between the Cossacks and Khazaria was hidden, it was not hidden to deceive future generations out of malice. It was hidden to stabilize an empire in its own time. But stability has a cost. It costs complexity. It costs memory. And sometimes it costs truth. As viewers, as readers of the past, we are not bound to those old compromises. We can afford to ask the questions that once threatened order. We can afford to look at the fragments and assemble them without fear of what the picture reveals. Because history does not belong to empires. It belongs to those willing to look past the surface. And this journey is far from over. There are other suppressed continuities, other buried systems, other moments where the past did not end, but was merely renamed. If you want to continue uncovering these hidden structures, these forgotten architectures of power that still shape our world, then stay with us. Subscribe and join this ongoing investigation into the histories that were not meant to survive, but did. And if you have your own thoughts, questions, or alternative interpretations, leave them below. History advances not through silence, but through scrutiny. The archive is vast, and we have only just begun to open it.